The inter-service rivalry between the U.S. Navy's aviation community and the U.S. Air Force goes back to, well, before the Air Force was even founded, really. Nevertheless, over the years, there have been a few times when the Air Force ended up adopting equipment that was originally intended for the Navy. Famous examples include the F-4 Phantom and the Sidewinder missile. But one of the less well-known cases was the Douglas B-66 Destroyer. This jet started life as the A-3 Sky Warrior, a carrier-based, short-range, nuclear-armed strategic bomber. Now, the performance of the A-3 was a generational leap over other jet bombers of the time, so much so that the Air Force legitimately thought that the Navy was fudging the numbers about the A-3. However, after its performance was validated, the Air Force took a fresh look at the Sky Warrior and decided that they wanted to get in on the action. This started a fairly significant redesign process, where initially the Air Force version was supposed to be mostly unchanged, but after only a few months, the Air Force had given Douglas a list of so many changes and modifications that the new bomber would need to be significantly redesigned. This, unsurprisingly, caused delays and cost increases. It also caused a lot of drama and amplified the inter-service rivalry, with all kinds of accusations flying around that the Air Force was changing things just to highlight that they had different needs from the Navy. And it's commonly accepted by modern observers that most of the design modifications to the B-66 were really just unnecessary, though the motivation remains a topic of debate. Regardless of all that, the new B-66 entered service in 1956. The conventional bomber version, the B-66B, was only used in limited numbers, about 70 of them were in service, but the design proved well suited to other roles, with roughly 180 being used for reconnaissance and electronic warfare duties. The Air Force B-66s were all retired by 1975, but some versions of the Navy's A-3 Sky Warrior remained in service aboard the carriers all the way until September of 1991. What we get in War Thunder is the B-66B Destroyer, a jet bomber in rank 6 of the American tech tree at battle rating 9.0 for air and 8.7 for ground. This jet was nerfed pretty hard since it was originally in the dev blogs, and it doesn't get either of its two radar sets. It does get the AN/APS-54 radar warning receiver, which is useful. It gets an optical bomb sight, but no ballistics computer of any kind. It's possible that the snail may change this jet's features after I publish the video, because they love to do that. So if you're watching this like weeks or months after it's been published, make sure to check for a pinned comment. It also has a gun turret in the tail with a pair of 20mm M24A1 cannons. It's supposed to be radar guided, but isn't, so you're basically limited to manual gunnery. For loadouts, you get two options: a rack of 14 750-pound bombs, or a rack of 4 3,000-pound bombs. Both of these are good choices. It takes 8 of the 750-pounders to take out a base, or 2 of the 3,000-pounders. So my recommendation is to take the 750s if you're going for AI ground units, and the 3,000s if you're doing bases. The flight performance of the B-66 is actually really good for a jet bomber, to the point where I was kinda surprised. Now, the initial low-speed acceleration is bad, so coming off the runway can feel like you're crawling, and I'll get to that in a minute. But once this thing gets in the air and up above like 400 kilometers an hour, the acceleration is good and it's generally just fast. Now, it's still subsonic, and if you push it past Mach 1 in a dive, it'll rip itself apart, but still, among subsonic jets, this thing has really high performance, and it can even outrun some of the subsonic fighters in its bracket. The rate of climb is really good too, so if you want to fly up to space for high-altitude bombing, the B-66 will get you there. Also, it's got an air brake, which actually matters, since if you have to dive at high speeds, you're putting yourself at risk of overspeeding the airframe and ripping the plane apart. Generally, you want to try and keep the destroyer below around 0.95 Mach. This brings us to kind of a sore spot for the plane. On most maps, it doesn't get an air spawn, at least as of making this review. This means that stuff like B-57s or other air spawn planes are almost always going to beat you to the first round of targets if they want to. But the B-66 gets a cluster of very powerful Ratopods, and as always, you don't actually need them to take off. You can take the Ratopods with you for a massive speed boost on demand, but I want to warn you, don't try to use the Ratopods in horizontal flight unless you're almost stalled out from low speed or something. If you do, you're going to rip the B-66 apart. Instead, save them for a vertical climb. If you pitch up and fire them off at medium to high speeds, you can gain thousands of meters in altitude in barely a couple of seconds without losing any of your airspeed. This ends up having enormous utility value to escape from people chasing you or avoid SAMs or whatever. When you take the B-66 into air battles, it's basically the usual bomber gameplay loop with only a few real opportunities to change things up. As I mentioned, you don't get an air spawn in a lot of matches, so at least half the time you're going to end up missing the first round of targets. You can use the 750s to mop up ground units, or take the larger bombs and kind of swing wide, hopeful that targets will spawn back in by the time you get there, or that your buddies get intercepted before making their drop. If you do get an air spawn, it's a whole other story, and it'll be much more simple to compete for targets. It's also worth the reminder that this thing gets tiered into supersonic fighters and air-to-air missiles, so you have to be pretty careful with your routing if you want to survive, especially in an up tier. Now, I want to take a moment and mention the tail gun. As of making this review, 20mm cannon damage is bugged, and these guns overheat pretty quickly, so the gun turret is more of a deterrent than an actual source of defensive kills. If we ever get the radar guidance back or the cannon damage gets fixed, it might be a different story. Out over a ground battle, the Destroyer is a serious glass cannon. The 3,000-pound bombs have a huge blast radius, and you get 4 of them, which gives you good potential for at least 1 or 2 kills anytime you spawn into this thing. However, its radar warning receiver is limited to the I-band, which means there are a few ground radars you won't detect tracking you. And it's the same BR bracket as stuff like the Ocelot, so infrared surface-to-air missiles are a serious threat. The lack of any kind of countermeasures makes the B-66 highly vulnerable to incoming fire, which is why I mentioned a minute ago that you might want to save your Ratopods to try and make a quick vertical evasion if you see a missile coming in. But depending on your starting altitude, you might only have like 2 seconds to react anyway. Now, don't get the wrong idea. This thing has the potential to be a monster in close air support. It's just pretty easy to counter, and you might get shot down a lot. Visually, this is a great looking jet. Now, you only get 2 skins for it, which both look mostly the same, so I hope you like aluminum overcast, because that's what you're getting. Now still, the 3D model is really well done, and overall, they did a great job with this plane. Landing is easier than some other jet bombers, and its good handling extends down to landing speeds. You can put the gear out at over 450 kilometers an hour and the flaps at about 370, and it gets a drag chute. Very beginner-friendly to land, at least as far as large bombers go. The cockpit is actually not a low-poly placeholder for once. Great visual details on the internals, but it's a bomber, so visibility isn't great. Not that you'd expect it to be. More immersive than usual if you're using a VR headset. To close out on the B-66B Destroyer. This jet has an enormous bomb load. It's surprisingly fast. It gets Ratopods with a lot of utility value. And it has a tail gunner. However, Gaijin hit this thing with the Nerf bat, and it's missing most of its advanced equipment. It doesn't get countermeasures, and it doesn't get an air spawn on most maps. The final verdict on the B-66B is that this plane is high risk but high reward, and it can rack up large mission scores pretty easily if it can evade interception. If you like bomber gameplay generally, you're gonna love this thing. As always, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, check out this next one.